Hello, okay, as you can see, I'm in school today. I'm teaching a bunch of year 3 and 4s, but it's okay, it's story time, and it's nearly the summer holidays. So, chapter 25, Parcel for Will. After helping the stable boy clean the cart and bed down for Kitty in her stable, Clara and Robert walked back down the hill to the gardens. Clara pushed the final piece of her Chelsea bun into her mouth, her gums aching at the sugary sweetness. "Thanks for the bun, Clara," Robert said, licking a shred of lemon peel from his thumb. Clara smiled. Robert had been surly and pale-faced when he'd returned from the frame-maker's shop. But as they made their way out of the town, his shoulders had seemed to relax and he'd begun to chat. He had become quite animated as he spoke of the poor wheat harvest that year, how he was concerned that there may be food shortages soon and perhaps even rationing. Clara had thought of the Gilberts' pantry, loaded with jam jars, pickles and chutneys. Perhaps she would ask to take a few home with her if she ever went home. Having left Robert with Mr. Gilbert outside the bothy, Clara opened the door to the cottage. A note from Mrs. Gilbert was on the sideboard saying that she would be working late at the big house. It was an opportunity she could not ignore. The bun Chelsea had eaten sat heavy in her stomach as she trapezed upstairs and unhooked the key to the locked room from behind the Gilberts' bed. She should not be trespassing in the Gilberts' room again. She most certainly should not be taking keys and unlocking doors and reading letters which did not belong to her. But what if other letters had arrived, ones that did belong to her? She had been at the cottage for over a week and there had been no word from her mother, no answer to the letters she had written and asked Mrs. Gilbert to post. Clara walked to the bureau and picked up the envelope on top of the pile. Just like last time, there was no name or address on the front. Was this the same letter she had already read? Or could it be a new one? She slipped out the sheaf of paper and began to read. October 1916. My dearest, time is passing so quickly. The days are shortening and Alfred has thrown himself into the gardens. He is obsessed with them. He is often at work with his spade and fork before sunrise and does not return until tea time. Afterwards we sit by the fire, barely speaking as we stare into the flames, both wishing for the same thing, I am sure. To be free. Oh, to hear you laugh. What joy that would bring me. Maybe tonight, when I creep through the gardens whilst everyone sleeps, I will see you. I will be waiting as usual, near our favourite pineapple house. Your fondest, Lizzie. Still don't know. Clara stared hard at the words, willing them to reveal their secret. Mrs. Gilbert had admitted in her letter that she was creeping around the gardens and visiting the hothouses. As much as Clara did not want to believe it, Will's theory that the Gilberts were stealing the fruit, the pineapple, could be right. And wasn't it a little peculiar that Mrs. Gilbert was not specifically dating her letters? Did she have any intention of addressing them and posting them? Carefully pushing the letter back into the envelope, she placed it back on top of the pile, ensuring it rested at a slight angle, just as she had found it. That evening, Will's face was paler than usual, his eyes red-rimmed when Clara met him at the boiler house. Robert came to see me, he said, his voice cracked and low. He picked up a lump of coal and threw it into at the wall. It shattered into tiny pieces. Clara's tongue felt too large for her mouth. Had she made Robert suspicious by questioning him about his family on the way to town earlier? Father's regiment had returned his uniform and personal items. Will slumped on the blanket next to Clara. Oh, said Clara, handing him the bun she had bought in town. Will didn't even look inside the paper bag, just placed it on the blanket beside him. Clara picked at the skin around her thumbnail. Was that why Robert's cheeks had been pinched and pale earlier on? He must have been to collect their father's things from the post office. What will you do with them? She hugged her knees to her chest. Despite the warmth from the furnace, coal seeped through her bones, making her shudder. I think, he paused, Robert and I think they should be buried. The boiler spat and hissed. Clara turned and looked at Will in surprise, remembering the funeral she had seen in town earlier that day. In a churchyard? No, said Will wearily. That wouldn't be allowed. Where then? Father and I came to visit Robert soon after he'd started working here. It was springtime. The trees were full of bird songs, bulbs were pushing up through the soil, everything was fresh and new, like a drawing that had just been finished. Clara's throat ached, for the things Will had just told her, for the loss of his father, for the things that might have happened to her own brother that she was still not brave enough to face. Will reached behind him for a cushion-sized parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. He placed it on his lap and dragged in a breath. "Do you want to see?" he asked. Clara felt her head nod. The anxiety in her stomach grew larger, like a rolling snowball. She did not know what she had imagined, but it wasn't for their father's possessions to be sent like a normal parcel through the post. Surely there should have been a trumpet playing, a parade, a more fitting acknowledgement that he gave his life for his country than just a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. Will pulled on the string, folded back the paper. The olive green uniform was similar to her father's and the one Christopher had been wearing when he had left home. Walking proudly down the street, his back straight, his eyes dancing and ready for the adventures to come. As Will unfolded the fabric, Clara drew in a sharp breath. The left arm of the jacket had been roughly cut away. A dark brown stain covered the shoulder. Blood. Will had told her the telegram informing them of their father's death had said it had been quick and painless and that he had not suffered. But how can any death caused by war be painless? A wave of dizziness washed over Clara as Will brought the jacket close to his face. He drew in a deep breath through his nose. "It smells musty, not of him," he said in a flat voice. Clara placed a hand on Will's arm, tears burning in her throat. "What do you think happens when we die, Will asked quietly. Clara pulled away her hand and closed her eyes for a second. The room was spinning, like she was on a merry-go-round at a town fair. When she opened them again, the first thing she saw was Will's notebook lying open. She picked it up, tracing a finger over the drawing of a pineapple, so detailed that she could see individual quilts and spikes. She drew in a deep, steadying breath. "I think it might be like falling into the gaps between pictures on a page," she said slowly. "Just not there anymore." Will pressed the jacket to her cheeks. "I like that," he said. His face was flushed, his eyes watery. He sniffed and looked at the ceiling. "Your father would have been proud of you, Will," Clara said softly. "You think?" Clara nodded. "Your drawings of the garden, your plans for the future. He would have liked hearing about those." A flash of embarrassment crossed Will's face, but a small smile also crinkled the corners of his mouth. Would you come with me to bury Father's uniform tonight?" Clara frowned. "What about Robert?" Will's lips thinned. "He won't come. Tell me he couldn't face it." "But he's your brother." Will shook his head. "He finds these things hard." Clara rubbed at the cold stain on her apron, remembering her conversation with Robert as the horse and cart jolted them into town. He was finding things difficult. That much she could see, but not to want to be there for your own brother at a time like this was hard to understand. Will carefully rewrapped the uniform. "I know you find things hard too, Clara, but you should open the letter from the War Office. There's nothing scarier than not knowing the truth," he said sadly. Clara pressed her lips together, picked up a piece of fallen coal and clasped it in her hand. Will was right. She must pluck up the courage to open the letter. But maybe tomorrow would be the day her mother would contact Mrs. Gilbert. Perhaps she would send for Clara to come home and she would be able to thrust the letter into her mother's make things better fingers, and she would not have to make any more decisions at all. Oh, goddamn page. What time are we on? We'll get this one done quickly. Chapter 26, Being Brave. It was past midnight, the moon was almost full, the sky clear and cold, and the sound of rifle fire seemed closer than usual. Clara pulled her shawl around her shoulders and shivered. "Are you sure the regiment aren't practicing in the woods?" she whispered to Will. Straying beyond the gardens when soldiers were firing their rifles did seem rather foolish. "Not the part that we're going to," Will replied, hugging the parcel containing his father's things close to his chest. As they wound their way around the garden to a door in the east wall which led to the woods, The shovel Clara was carrying clanked painfully against her shins. Will pushed open the door and gestured for Clara to go ahead. Stepping forward, her right boot sank into something soft and very ungrass-like. She bent down, her breathing hitched in her throat when she saw what it was, a squished boot imprint mandarin. "Goodness, look," she whispered to Will, picking up the pulpy mess. A dribble of juice ran down her wrist. As she stood up, she noticed two small stone Cupid statues on plinths, one either side of the door. The first Cupid's hand was empty-handed, but in the right palm of the second statue rested another mandarin. The one had been trodden on had probably rolled off the first statue's hand, maybe helped by a puff of wind. Will did not respond, just clutched his father's parcel closer to his chest as he stared at the fruit. Clara carefully placed the squished mandarin back where it had fallen from and wiped her fingers on her apron. Now was not the time to wonder why the fruit was being deliberately left in the gardens, for she was sure that it was. Now, though, was the time to help Will. Neither of them spoke as their feet crackled over twigs, brushed through nettles and around brambles. "Here," Will said. After Clara had counted, they had walked past 76 trees of varying size and shapes. Breath steamed from their lips as they stood in a small clearing, tree stumps perching on the soil like giants' feet. Clara leaned the shovel against one of the stumps, which had overgrown with lichen. Will placed the parcel on another, and then picked up the shovel. "Snowdrops grow here in the spring. Crocuses too. Father loved them," Will said. A snake of cold air wriggled down the neck of Clara's coat. She pushed autumn away, instead imagining the sun dappling through the trees, the earthly smell of green shoots pushing through the soil, life beginning all over again. Will began to dig, shoveling earth over his shoulder. He paused, took off his jacket and wiped his brow and a cough racking his chest. Clara took the jacket from him and folded it over her arm. The hole Will was digging grew deeper, plenty large enough for the parcel. Lines of sweat trickled down his face. He coughed again and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Distant rifle fire echoed through the trees. Will was right. The regiment were practicing in a different part of the woods tonight, but a sharp staccato burst still dried Clara's mouth and caused her hands to ball into fists. Were these the sounds that Will's father had heard as he died, the sound her father and brother had grown accustomed to? She did her best to push through the thoughts away. "I think it's big enough, Will," Clara whispered. Just going to pause, Miss Patterson's on the way. I got and had to do a job, and then I ran out of time, so we're finishing this part off at home. I'm sorry. "I think it's big enough, Will," Clara whispered, but the clinks of metal through the soil and the sound of Will's laboured breathing smothered her words. Will grunted, flinging soil over his shoulders as the hole grew bigger still. Clara took a step forward. "It's done, Will," she said, louder this time. Still, Will continued to dig. He stood in the hole, his legs swallowed by the heap of earth, so he seemed only half the person he actually was. "Will!" Clara said urgently. Will paused, then glanced at Clara as if he had forgotten she was there. "Yes," he said in a strangled voice. He looked down at the hole. He looked at the parcel. "You'd best hand that to me." Clara carefully picked up the package and passed it to him. Will hugged it to his chest one more time. He dipped his chin and sucked in a deep breath. A huge cough made his body shake. Robert should be here to help his brother, Clara thought. Will should not be doing this alone. But Robert wasn't there, and she was. Clara stepped forward, her boots sinking into the soil. She laid her hands over Will's. Very gently she guided the parcel towards the hole. They crouched beside one another, their hands still joined. Will's fingers were icy and encrusted with mud, but that did not matter one jot to Clara. She pressed the parcel into the soil under her own nails. Fingers and hands were still... She pressed the parcel into the soil until her own nails, fingers and hands were as dirty as his. "Goodbye," Clara whispered. Will began to tremble, like someone had taken hold of his body and was giving it a jolly good shake. He wiped his nose again, then sprang to his feet and began to shovel soil on top of the parcel until all traces of the brown paper were hidden. Clara forced her eyes to stay fixed on Will's stony face, even though a tiny part of her wanted to turn away, run away, from the woods, from the buried uniform stained with blood, from the tears sliding down his cheeks. It was done. Will dropped the shovel to the ground. He wrapped his arms around his middle and bent forwards, as if he had a pain in his side. Clara folded her arms around her own body, trekking over snowy mountains, floating through the air high above the world in a balloon. That took a kind of bravery. But this was a different type of bravery, a type Clara had never seen before, and very much hoped she would never have to see again. Let's get this one. Chapter 27, The Basket. October 1916. So this is one of Mrs. Gilbert's letters. My dearest, do you remember the first time you tasted a home-grown pineapple from the hothouse? How sweet the yellow flesh was, so different to the imported pineapples that arrived, salt-weathered and sour, at the London docks. The sheer delight on your face. It takes me much effort to rise in the mornings now. I find my mind drifting to you while I work, directing the scullery maids to blacken the hearths and lay the fires at the big house. I have little appetite to clean my own cottage. Alfred has mentioned more than once the cobwebs hanging in the corner, the ball of dust drifting under the bed like silent mice. He is suspicious, I think, but I am beyond caring. All I wish is for us to be together, my dear. Your fondest, Lizzie. We still don't know who she's writing these letters to. Clara slid the letter into the envelope. It was as if the letter was magnetised, drawing her into the room to read them, despite the risk of being caught. Mrs. Gilbert must be in the room, writing her secret letters, while Clara had been helping Will bury his father's things the night before. She checked each drawer of the bureau again for letters from her mother. There was none. Locking the door, Clara returned the key to the Gilbert's bedroom and ran downstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. Hurling open the door to the garden, she pulled in a breath of early afternoon autumn air, which was thinner and chillier than it had been. She walked quickly down the slope towards the boiler house. She wondered what Will was doing, sleeping, stoking the boiler, drawing in his notebook. The way he spoke about the pineapples and the hothouse was so tender, like they were his family. Maybe they were now. He's got no one else. Mr. Gilbert was talking to Robert under the apple trees. He was gesturing, pointing at the hothouses. Clara skirted through the trees until she was standing near enough to hear what was being said. 2, you say, said Robert. Yes, and a dozen peaches as well. The Earl will want the police involved, Mr. Gilbert said firmly. Not yet, said Robert quickly. I've been keeping watch. I'll stay up tonight, try and catch them. They're bound to try again. You sure about that? Mr. Gilbert asked curtly. I'm not sure what you mean, said Robert. Have you been watching the hothouses? By all accounts, you were tucked up in your bed early last night, snoring the place down. A fly buzzed around Clara's head. She swatted it away. The work in the gardens is tiring, Robert said eventually. His voice was thin, edged with guilt. Of course it is, lad. There's a war on, which means more work for everyone. And on top of that, a thief is ransacking the Earl's hothouse, Mr. Gilbert said wearily. I'm sorry. Clara's legs felt like jelly. More fruit had been taken, and it happened when they were not keeping watch. Coming back from the woods the previous night, Will had been shaky, his feet stumbling over every branch, around every bush. Clara had persuaded him to return to the boiler house and sleep, rather than keep watch of the hothouse. She had been exhausted too. It had been an odd kind of tiredness, which had made her limbs feel heavy and caused her to collapse into bed as soon as she got back to her own room, sleep engulfing her the instant her head touched the pillow. As usual, she had left her bedroom window open, but nothing and no one had woken her. No nightmare or creak of a hothouse door or footsteps thudding across the grass, no voices carried by the breeze. Clara itched to speak with Will.
She rested a hand on the trunk of a gnarly apple tree, laid her cheek against the rough bark. "I promise a basket of apples to the regiment," Mr. Gilbert said, reaching up and picking a couple of apples, then placing them in a barrow. "Can you take them to them?" "As you said, there's a lot to be done here," Robert replied in a clipped voice. There was a pause. Mr. Gilbert picked another apple and dropped it into his barrow. "The army also has a lot to do keeping us safe." Robert kicked hard at a fallen apple with the toe of his boot. It split into several pieces. Mr. Gilbert picked up his spade, flung it over his shoulders, and strode off to the far side of the gardens. An idea was simmering in Clara's head. A stack of wicker baskets leaned against the brick wall nearby. Uncurling herself from the tree, Clara walked across and picked one up, looping it over her arm. The breeze ruffled the leaves above her head and the apples bobbed and bounced. Robert was looking at her. She ignored him, reached up to one of the lower branches, chose an apple flush with pink, and twisted. It came away in her hand. She placed it in the basket, then carried on twisting and picking until the basket was half filled. Robert wandered over and glanced into a basket. "You're picking a good crop there," he said, leaning against the tree. His eyes looked pink, his top lip beaded with sweat. "I thought you might need some help," said Clara. "There's so much to be done," said Robert, "sometimes too much." He took off his glasses, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and blew his nose, then wiped his face. A pang of sympathy tightened Clara's jaw. Poor Robert. Mr. Gilbert was working him very hard. All the worry he had been hiding Will, then finding somewhere to live. It must be so wearying. "I can help. Would you like me to pick more apples?" Robert pushed a handkerchief into his pocket and glanced at Mr. Gilbert, who was digging a planting bed along the back wall. "I need to take some apples to the regiment camp." "I could take them," Clara said eagerly, maybe too eagerly. "I have nothing else to do," she added with a shrug. Robert scratched his chin. "It would be a help. I have to ready another cartload of vegetables for the hospital and tend to the leaks. There just aren't enough hours in the day." "No, there really aren't," replied Clara, pressing her boots into the grass. "Don't worry. I'll take the apples and be back before you know it." "You really are helpful, aren't you?" Robert said thoughtfully. Clara felt his eyes on her like the prickle of a beetle walking up her arm. She needed to be careful not to make him suspicious. She forced her lips into a bright smile and pushed away the tinge of unease in her gut. Taking the apples to the regiment would help Robert, but maybe a little selfishly. She hoped it would help her more. When Will heard that more fruit had been taken, he was bound to bring up his theory again that Mrs. Gilbert was the thief. When he spoke like that, his voice changed, became harder, and it made Clara's head ache. If she could visit the regiment camp, maybe she could find Thomas, the soldier, and ask him what had been inside the basket Mrs. Gilbert had given him. She felt certain that Mrs. Gilbert had nothing to do with the stolen pineapples, and while she and her aunt did not get on the way she hoped, it was important to prove this to Will, so they could concentrate on finding the real culprit. And that we're going to leave it there. Sorry that was a bit longer than normal, but we've got to get through it in a short amount of time. So come back tomorrow and we'll hopefully find out some of the answers to the mysteries.